First of all, the corona pandemic caught the Israeli system not ready to cope with the challenges that it had to confront. We were not ready from the point of view of the digital infrastructure, both in schools, but mainly in the homes of the Israeli students and their parents, of course. We were not, the teachers as a whole were not trained for any digital and distance teaching. Some of them were. Whatever I'm saying is always, you have to say, to realize I'm speaking generally, not for the entire, not for everybody. The teaching materials and the curriculum, they were not ready for teaching for distance learning. And there was really, no one really knew what are the lines of responsibility between the various agents in the system. What's the responsibility of Ministry of Education? What's the responsibility of local authority? What are the responsibilities of the principals? What the teachers should do? Now, in spite of the poor performance of the Ministry of Education in preparing the system for such a situation, I would say that due to mainly to those non-Israeli ability to improvise, many schools really managed to teach students, and some of them with a high degree of success. But whoever was responsible for this, it wasn't the Ministry of Education, but it was either the local authorities, the principals, and the teachers themselves, which without guidance, without really having instructions, they did their best for the long period, for a period of over 2 months, to teach and keep in touch with their students. And they were doing, on the whole, I would say, they performed quite well. Even though some of the parents and people around didn't think so, in my opinion, the teacher course, the teachers were doing well above and beyond the call of duty, as a matter of fact. First of all, the main lesson is that the education system can, for quite a long time, continue to function while schools are physically closed. Second, the situation of big stress and difficulties like corona pandemic create also unforeseen opportunities and can propel very fast and desired changes that under other circumstances would take many years. The main problem that we really discovered or were faced with, and even though it was quite, we should know that this will happen, is that the gaps between the socioeconomic groups that are already very wide are getting wider because of the very unequal basic conditions. What I mean is there are differences in all the physical structures of the digital infrastructure in schools, but mainly in homes. And it's some of homes, in more affluent homes, you would say there are many rooms at home. Every child has his own room, his own computer, and there are no problems. But many homes, they either don't have a computer at all, or there's only one computer at home. And what's more important, that people from a high socioeconomic background, the parents can help the students to cope with digital distance learning much more than parents from low socioeconomic background, and particularly because also the burden of the lockdown of the economy was far more heavy on the low socioeconomic groups rather than the higher one.
First of all, that the best results were achieved by people who had autonomy of teachers, autonomy of headmasters, people who could make decisions for themselves, knowing their own communities. And the solutions ranged from teaching online to actually, we heard yesterday in a discussion we had about the pandemic, places in the south of Israel where there are no computers, teaching by very, very basic means. So it's not only digital teaching, it's actually being flexible, reading the needs of your community and working with the children as they, as they need and in ways that are fitting their environment. It's no good to say to children that have no electricity at home, let's learn digitally. And it's no good to say to people that are in the area of the pandemic, come to school to take teaching materials. You have to be very flexible. And I think this is something that all over the world, ministries of education find very hard to do. Israel's Ministry of Education is certainly very centralized, maybe over-centralized. And in this respect, there is a long way to go. I think the one conclusion everybody agrees on is that you should give more autonomy to the people on the ground and to get better understanding of how we can share responsibility, how we can bring on the municipal level, how we can bring on the headmasters, how we can involve the parents who became partners to the teaching profession now, because suddenly mothers were demanded to be teachers. And I don't know if you've seen this wonderful video of the angry mom from Israel complaining about the overload of the moms, but that was certainly true. If you have 2 or 3 children at home, even if you have a computer and you're middle class and you're sort of educated, you are not necessarily ready and prepared to teach all the different materials your children learn at school. So that's a very really difficult challenge, and mothers didn't know how to deal with it. Mostly mothers. Some fathers took a role in it too, but it was mainly a mother's things. And everything we know about our society became more extreme: social and economic gaps, gender gaps, ability gaps. Children with special needs were in terrible situation because they couldn't, participate in learning from a distance. Children in areas where parents went into, economic shock. They had problems with their employment, with their housing, with their nutrition. All those things suddenly were visualized. I think what the pandemic did, it sort of, like we are sitting now, it just gave us a picture of our society on our screen. And we knew that that child doesn't have a computer. And here, if you look on a municipal level or a regional level, this region is not functioning because they are poor and they are unable to cope with it. So it sort of forced us maybe to look at ourselves in a more critical way than we used to. And that, I think, is the beginning of an understanding of how education should change. We are talking about the future of education since, the beginning of the 21st century. The 21st century is here, and we are well into the 21st century, and we should be thinking again on how to revise education. Maybe the one thing we should, sort of change the gear is to say, we should learn from the children how to teach them. Because if we keep on talking to ourselves about how we learned, we're irrelevant for the 21st century, and we should do something different.
First of all, we will have to invest heavily in all aspects and areas that facilitate narrowing of gaps between the various socioeconomic groups, especially the Arabs and the Haredim. Second, we have to prepare, the Ministry of Education, as a matter of fact, have to prepare a whole set of future plans agreed upon by all partners. And those plans have to be budgeted and executed in order to cope with possible scenarios of long-term disruptions in the usual school activities. Third, we have to create, as soon as possible, a National Council of Education. Its main task will be a long-range thinking and planning. It should be independent and free from daily chores of running the educational system. The best way will be if it will be outside of the Ministry of Education. We have two such councils which are adjunct to the Prime Minister office. They are budgeted by the Prime Minister office, and they are responsible to the Prime Minister. And I think it should be a good idea to have such a National Council for Education in the Prime Minister office. We have also to revise the concept of traditional schooling in a way that diminish somewhat its role as a knowledge transmitter and extend and enlarge its role as a promoter of social interaction. The main damage was in this lockdown or in this closure of schools was the severance of social interaction between students and teachers, and between teachers and themselves. And finally, we'll have to improve all channels of communication and cooperation between the Ministry of Education, the local authorities, teacher unions, teachers and principals, parents and students, and the entire society. In a nutshell, that would be, I would think, from my point of view, the main recommendations that I would like to propose. Thank you very much.
What happened in Israel is no different from what happened in other countries in the world. I had the privilege of teaching a course on education during the pandemic at Oxford, by Zoom, of course. I had students from 17 different countries. They all did relatively similar things. They had similar policies. They had similar challenges. In most cases, probably in all cases, the ministries weren't well prepared for the challenge. It was up to the teachers and the headmasters to cope with the ongoing crisis. So we're not looking at an Israeli situation. It's important to understand this is something that happened to education worldwide, both by the way, in the developed and the developing world. Everybody had the same experience, and the pandemic challenged us to rethink education on a global level. And that's, I think, is a mighty challenge. We were talking before the meeting started, we said, for us, people who are working in education, we have enough materials for the rest of our lives, because this was the biggest experiment ever done in human history in education. Billions of children not going to schools, changing the means of teaching within few days. So a lot went wrong, but we also learned a few things that I think Nahum mentioned.
I was speaking about a more long-range development. What I mean is that schools should understand, schools, principals, the entire schooling community should understand that transmitting knowledge is very important, but it's not, it can be done outside of school. We can teach students how to look for knowledge, how to learn, not only inside the school, but interaction, social interaction. You cannot do on air. Social interaction, and school will be probably the most important playground for having this social interaction. Therefore, I think it's a course that the schools would go anyway, but the corona pandemic, it only just make it faster, and the entire process will be much more faster now than it was before, because everybody will see that no digital learning, no distance learning can come instead of the social interaction, which is in school. That was my main point, and that really is a challenge for Yuli Tamir, because Yuli Tamir is going to head one of the best schools, schools for teachers. That the entire role of the teacher should change. He is not only the knowledge transmitter. He should be a leader and the role model for his students and other teachers. That was my point that I'm trying to make. And one more remark about autonomy. Autonomy is not given by the Ministry of Education. Autonomy was taken by teachers and principals. And they took this autonomy and they took the responsibility, and the Ministry of Education had nothing to do with it. And I hope will not try to restrain it.
It's true, Nachum is right, autonomy was taken, but you can easily take it back. And the one thing is that we want the ministry to do is to release the teachers, the headmasters, the people around us to do their educational work with as little restraint as possible. The other thing is that in order to change teaching, and I agree with Nachum, it's a huge challenge and I don't know exactly what to do. I need your help. All of you have ideas. But in order to be able to teach differently, we have to change the goals of education. Traditionally, we had, a very clear set of goals. What is an educated person? Look behind me, all these books, I'm an old generation. You had to read some of them in order to be an educated person. Maybe things are different now, and maybe we should ask ourselves different questions in order to be really relevant to what future adults will need. And it's very difficult to know what future adults will need in 25 years. We hardly know what will happen next summer. So changing the way we teach is also changing the way we think about knowledge, about what it is to be educated, what is our responsibility as educators. Are there things everyone should know, or should everyone structure their own set of sort of skills and knowledge along their multiple intelligence, as they used to say in the old days? These are very, very difficult questions. And I'm afraid, as we mentioned, education systems move very slowly. Take into account the following fact. Next year, with all the storm we've gone through, most of the teachers in schools and all of the teachers in the teachers training colleges will be the same people who were there before and were trained probably 20 years before. We're not prepared to close the digital gap, but let me just say one thing about it. It's impossible, and I hope Nachum will agree, because we have been talking about this for years. You can't put all the burden on education. In societies where there is an enormous social economic gap, even if you give every child a computer or a smartphone or something else to work with, the digital gap will be there. It's not only something that you close by educational means. You have to think much more holistically and think about social and economic conditions in terms of housing, employment, parents' guidance, mother skills. There are about 15 things that, change the way a child can learn. And it's this learning abilities that we have to support, not merely by supporting education, but by creating other environmental changes that will allow children to learn in better ways.
I would like to add that the equipment issue is the small issue. And it's really, it's small both financially and from the macro point of view. The problem of the gaps is the situation at home, the parents' education, and their ability to help the student and so on. So we are not going to close the gap by buying computers to students. The ministry education system is the only system that really stops working 2 months a year on a regular basis. So we know that the 2 months of closing schools, they usually have some impact of losing some kind of knowledge during summer vacation, but this is nothing new. The educational system will not break on closing school for 2.5 months. But the issues, the gaps probably will become bigger because all kind of supporting systems that usually have during summer and all kind of activities during the summer that people didn't have, and all kind of stress at homes that people who were laid off from work and they have terrible economic problems at home. This will impact much more students from lower socioeconomic groups than the students from other groups. And we have some indications from other places that really had some closure of schools for a long time, that the closure of schools has a much more difficult impact on students from lower socioeconomic background than on the higher socioeconomic.
Somewhat related is, we have at the Taub Center an initiative on early childhood development and inequality. And from within that group, we conducted a survey of families with children aged 6 and under, trying to understand how the lockdown at home was affecting families and children. And the results of that survey, and not surprisingly, we definitely see differences based on income loss and socioeconomic background. And that survey will be coming out later in the summer. One study based on that survey will be coming out later in the summer.
I know that there are several groups now that brings experts together to rethink education. None of them has gone very far because it's very new. I think it would be quite unusual for any other set of circumstances for us to even try to draw conclusions after 2 months. We usually would say that's too early, but then you have to open the year at the 1st of September. I have to open an academic year and I don't know what I'm going to do. So I have to rush into conclusions, and that's what I'm going to do. And we will all rush into conclusion and we'll make lots of mistakes. And that would be fascinating for us as researchers. This is, as I said, the best time to be sitting on the researcher seat. And we will have to learn. It will be mostly trial and error because we don't really have the time now to restructure. Nachum can tell you, I did a very big school reform. It took years to implement it and to sort of make people ready to work in a different way. And it was a minor change. in comparison to what we demand right now. So I'm really, I'm really urging us to work against our academic instincts and work fast, because we have no other choice. We have to open the school year, and there will be a huge disappointment. And I'm already preparing myself for that. And we should all be preparing ourselves. Public education system will be criticized for not changing fast enough because people don't understand how change is done in these systems. So at least some, I don't know, at least a feeling of change, a willingness to change should be there, and it will be minor and it will be disappointing, and we should say it right now. Because when we'll be disappointed afterwards, at least we should prepare ourselves. We should have very realistic expectations. And again, this is against our instincts. We want to say the education system can solve everything. No, it can't. And it will take years to amend what happened now. In this respect, I disagree with Nahum. It's not the closure of the 2 months. It's the really, some children will keep up with the changes and benefit from them, and some children will be left behind and the gaps will grow. And we are not talking always about closing the gaps. We will now see the gaps grow, and we'll be even more disappointed from the system. So prepare yourself for a challenge.
I always have always pleased to discuss things with Yuli, and I never had the opportunity to be a policy maker. Only the maximum I was doing was to advise. But my advice to policymakers is to get as much as possible diverse advices. Finally, the buck stopped with the policymaker. But you have to be open to many different views. And that's a long discussion I have with Yuli. And I think it will be right today as well, because everyone will have a different opinion and different view, and everybody thinks that he knows better. And I agree, the policymaker has his responsibility to decide, and he or she, they will make a lot of mistakes, but it's natural, but still don't take one advice. Take as many as possible. And if I'm speaking about the Ministry of Education, don't limit yourself to the staff of the Ministry of Education. That's my opinion.
I just want to come back on this for a second. Two things. First of all, the big problems is ministers don't allow each other to cross their territories. And that's a really big problem, because ministries, now they've divided the ministry in the most awkward way possible. So every part of the ministry is in another ministry, and let's see all of them coordinate. But what I wanted to say when I heard Nahum is what we say here, we should be saying publicly. And I can tell you from a point of view of a policymaker, when you are a policymaker and you get these reports, the annual reports of whatever institution, doesn't matter which, they always say it's a catastrophe and that it's a failure. And the thing that we're saying now, let's allow people to try and fail, is not a real option for a politician. And it's our doing, it's the way we conceptualize democracy that makes politicians risk-averse. And when politicians are risk-averse, they're just doing what they did before because that's the surest thing to do. So if we want change, we have to go through a public discourse about how to accommodate change. And part of it is allowing people, including ministers, to fail. Because otherwise, nobody's going to do anything.
First of all, I think that in the future agreement with teachers, the whole idea of distance learning, it should be part of their job. Because distance learning is not going to disappear. And its role will be much more important in the future years, and it should be incorporated in their job description. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I don't think that you should ask teachers to do things that you don't ask other people to do. No one in this situation worked for free. People who worked from distance working from home, they were paid. And people who had to leave or to go on a vacation without pay, they agreed to give 9 days, but that was not the situation with the teachers. It seems to me that the whole idea that teachers don't work in the summer and that their job is easy job, a job for mothers who really don't want to work hard and so on, it should be eradicated. Teaching is one of the most difficult jobs that there is. Teachers do their vacation everywhere in the world. They have summer vacation, and I don't think that in this particular occasion you have to somehow to diminish their vacation or ask them to do what you really don't ask any other sector to do.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think I'm the last minister who worked with the unions, and I still have a very good relationship, at least with one of them. But your question, David, is a very difficult one to answer, because reconceptualizing a profession needs to take into account what happened to people who are there already. What happened to people who were trained many years ago? Do you do on-the-job training? Do you give them opportunities? There's a lot to think about, and that's not going to be an easy thing to do when we are trying to change the system, but then keep the people in the profession and not let them go because they are there and they have a tenure and they're not going to go anywhere. So it's a really, really difficult question.